Hey everyone, my name is Britt and this is Mikaela, and today we're going to talk to you all about some of our favorite books in verse. So we both use she, her, hers pronouns and work for the Pikes Peak Library District in Young Adult Services. So let's dive right on in. So yeah, let's talk about what is a book in verse?
A book in verse is exactly what it says on the tin. It's a book written in verse. It's a novel told through poetry. And I don't know about you, Britt, but it's one of my favorite formats for novels. 75% of that is because they're a really quick read. I love poetry anyway. I read a lot of poetry just because it's a different way of looking at language and what language can do, and not just in English, but in all languages.
No, it's awesome. Yeah, I'm kind of the opposite, where I hadn't really read a book in verse until I started working for the library, because when I was in high school, I hated poetry so intensely because we had to analyze it so much. And that is not why I read, right? I read normally to escape or to dive into a new world or find a new perspective or to learn something. But I am not into analyzing the English language. I'm not gonna lie, I just don't care. And I never have, but I love books in verse because it's kind of but that's why I didn't try them, right? So if that describes you, it's not the same. It's pretty different. It's more like listening to a song, a story told through a song.
But also, Hamilton, right?
Oh, totally.
I think Hamilton is written, hip hop is poetry.
We're gonna revisit that theme later.
So that's always something that pops in my head whenever I think about novels in verse too. It's if you like hip hop, or if you like any kind of song, you like poetry, because that's fundamentally what it is, or a form of poetry. Because I was also that kid in high school that really hated poetry, and I think that's one of the issues with high school, is that you have to analyze so many things that it takes the joy and the fun out of it.
Yeah, no, reading it outside of school, you can make it into what you want it to be instead of what your teacher wants you to want it to be, and that's the joy of it. All right, well, do you want to talk about your first book?
I do, and I'm gonna start with the poetry because I was just talking about it. But the first one that I want to talk about is called No Matter the Wreckage by Sarah Kay. It is delightful, you guys. Sarah Kay is a poet from New York City. She also does a lot of stuff on the internet. She's been writing for a really long time. And No Matter the Wreckage, like I said before, is the volume of poetry that got me back into poetry. Because it's very narrative in its structure, which I really like, because again, with novels in verse, it's narrative told through poetry, and poetry can tell a story just in a different way. She does tell a lot of stories through poetry of her childhood, about her parents, a lot about her family. Her brother makes an appearance a lot, growing up in Brooklyn. She just has a way with words that is really accessible, that you don't necessarily need to understand any of the you don't need to understand poetic language to understand her poetry, if that kind of makes sense. You don't have to have any foundational knowledge of iambic pentameter or whatever, any other poetry terms that you could throw around. She's on YouTube a lot. She does a lot of spoken word poetry, and a lot of the poems that are in this volume you can also find on YouTube. Button Poetry is, I think, a channel that she ends up on a lot, and that adds another layer of accessibility, right? Because poetry is often very inaccessible unless you can read it aloud, which I think a lot of people don't even try to do, because it's such a difficult thing to parse anyway.
Well, I'll talk about the book. I think if you want to try a book in verse, probably this is the most accessible one that I have read. So it's called Bull, and it's by David Elliot. It also ticks so many boxes for me, y'all. But if you do rap, that is the way it is written, basically. But it's the story, it's called Bull, right? So it's the story of the Minotaur, the Greek myth, which, if you don't know it, is very dark. But he takes this very dark myth, and then he tells it essentially seriously. The first line is Poseidon being "What's up, curse words. So like, you know, like that is the tone of this book. When I'm describing it to people, I normally say it's like Hamilton or Percy Jackson as done by the cast of Hamilton, because that's what it is, right? So I like, if you like mythology or anything like that, it's just a really good kind of intro point to like reading a book in verse. And then I just recently, he had another book come out in February and I got an advanced copy of it, and it is like paradoxically as similar and as different to like Bull as a book can be. Basically it's similar because it's like, it's a book in verse, right? A, and then B, it's a fairy tale retelling, so not like strict mythology, but like the Seventh Raven is a grim tale, so that's dark too because it said grim. But the Seventh Raven, so it's like, it's a fairy tale I'm not familiar with. This family has like 7 boys and they want a girl, and they get a girl, but when they get the girl, all of the boys turn into ravens. And so it's about the girl basically trying to bring her brothers back and make them humans. And so this one is a little less accessible than Bull. Like he tells, this would be a good one for English teachers to teach because it is both pretty accessible and interesting, but each character speaks in a different like poetry language.
Rad.
Yeah, so like, which I'm not gonna lie to you, I did not notice, but when you get to the end, he kind of spells it all out for you. And then there's also like, there's illustrations peppered throughout, and they're like creepy line drawings. So yeah, so it's definitely a little more on like the horror end, but it's really good. So David Elliot is just kind of an author I would generally recommend if you're trying to get into books in verse.
Another author, her like entire body of work at this point is a G-dang delight. Like Elizabeth Acevedo, like if you guys haven't read any Elizabeth Acevedo, she is one of the best authors that I think have come out of the last like 5 years. Poet X was her debut, which is delightful. She also has another book out called With the Fire on High that isn't in verse, but is so good. The chapters are really short in The Fire on High though, so like she still maintains that like level of accessibility and rhythm, even though it's prose and not poetry. Her most recent novel, Clap When You Land, is a novel in verse, and it is about 2 teenagers, Camino and Yahira, who are Yahira? I don't know how to pronounce that exactly. I'm gonna go with Yahira. There we are. If I'm wrong, someone correct me, please. They are, Camino is from the Dominican Republic. She lives there with her family, I believe her grandmother, and then Yahira lives in New York City with her mom. So they both have the same dad. And this dad unfortunately perishes in a plane crash from the Dominican Republic to New York or vice versa. And both girls find out about each other that way. And it is kind of revealed that their dad like had this really big secret. Like he's kept, there have been secret families, and both like they've been kept a secret from each other. But like I said, it's really rhythmic. Like Elizabeth Acevedo has a really, really rhythmic way of writing that again is really accessible and like you can hear it when you read it, which I really love. But it's also ultimately, this novel is all about grief and reckoning, right, with like this profound, like massive life-changing situation. Like not only has their father died, but like they find out that they have family in a different part of the world. And it's very well done. I love a thing about grief. Like at the end of the day, like that's one of my favorite things in the world. And it delves, into the different lives that these girls have. Like they're connected in this really profound way, but like because of geography, their lives are so completely different. And like how, as a teenager, like do you reckon with all of these things? Like how do you, when you find out something like this, like, how do you go about living your life? Like, can you, like, will your life ever be the same knowing what you know now? Which feels very true to like how life works in general, right? Like, it's really relatable because there are always things in our lives that like change the way that we see and how we move about the world in really, really profound ways that you then have to like accept and grieve and move on from.
Some of the things you're saying made me think a little bit about Long Way Down by Jason Reynolds. And I don't remember the year that book came out, but basically it's about this kid whose brother is killed on the streets. And so his kind of obligation after that is to kill the person who killed his brother. And so the book is about the main character deciding whether or not he wants to do that. And so is it light? It is not. But it is like, I'm not gonna lie, like after the end of the book, like I felt like someone had punched me in the stomach, but like in a really good way. You know what I mean? Like in a like, oh my God, I gained like, you know, you just, it's one of those books where you're like, the way Jason Reynolds writes, like I have nothing in common with the main character, right? Like I am a white girl from the rural South and he was a black kid from, I think, a more urban, I don't remember where it's set. So like, but even still, like the way Jason Reynolds writes is like, it's just so easy for you to like put yourself right in those shoes. And you just feel like you're there. You feel his pain and his like anguish over the decision making. And then, yeah, the end, oh my God, the end is, like I said, it's like, yeah, it's so good though. Like it was probably my favorite book of 2017. And for context, I read like at least 100 books a year. So like, that's saying something, you know what I mean? But yeah, it's just one of those books, like I said, where it's really easy to like identify with the main character and put yourself in the situation that you maybe haven't been in, but that a lot of people are in every day. And so I just think it's really important. I think it's just really important to read and sort of develop some of that empathy and maybe learn a little bit more about like a perspective that's different from yours in a really enjoyable way. Like it's both enjoyable and painful, like as much as some, you know how like good books make you just like feel everything. This is one of those books, I think.
100%. I love Jason Reynolds. Like oh man, I love everything that he's written because he is such an empathetic writer, right? Like I think fundamentally, and this comes through like in the things that he writes and also when he speaks. I have seen him and met him and it was the greatest day of my life. It's the whole thing. Oh my God, I love him. But it, like, he ultimately, from what I have seen and heard and read, like operates from a place of empathy, right? Like that is just his baseline. And he makes his characters so empathetic no matter where you come from. And that's one of the most incredible things I think about fiction is like your ability to project yourself into this and feel and understand things that you will never experience because of who you are, right? And the privileges that you have. And Long Way Down, exactly like you said, I think is one of the books that like really illustrates that for me the most, and like that power that fiction has. He's
another author where like just read everything he writes.
Literally everything. Yeah, definitely, like just continuing on this Jason Reynolds train. He's also done this book called For Everyone, which is one poem, and it's I think a tribute to Walter D. Myers, maybe.
It's also like it's kind of like a cheerleader, you can do this. And I don't know, I feel like everyone needs that right now, like everyone, you know?
Yeah, that's right. It's very much like it is a poem from Jason to everyone, like to you specifically, about dreams and the importance of them, and like not necessarily being able to understand them, but like communicating how important they are to have, no matter what they are and no matter how small. Yeah, it's so good. It's really, really fast. It's like this big. Like it's not long. I think he also reads parts of it on YouTube. Like if you can definitely find it there. I think I'm like looking at a video. Yeah, it's just it's delightful. And he reads the audiobook of that too, and just like him reading it to you is like turns into such a delightful experience. Like it's so good. It's so good.
Well, so similar but different is Punching the Air by Ibi Zoboi and Youssef Salaam. Have you read that one?
I haven't yet. It's in my room.
So there's cool artwork in it apparently, but Punching the Air is about, so Youssef Salaam is one of the Exonerated Five, aka the Central Park Five. If you're familiar with that story. But they're essentially these teens who were arrested and sent to jail for something that there was like no evidence of them having done. It was kind of a wrong place, wrong time situation. And so it's very clearly at least partially based on Youssef Salaam's experience. So it follows the teen as they are, in court on trial, and then as they end up in juvie, and then it really follows them in juvie. And it does get into the importance of art as like an emotional release, but it also is really a lot about like how we treat people in prison, especially youth. And it's really eye-opening in a really disturbing way, to be honest.
It's another heavy book that like definitely gets at a lot of empathy, right? Like
exactly.
It makes a situation that you'll probably never be in really accessible. And like I can't recommend books that do that enough. Like anything that gets you to be more empathetic and understand other people's circumstances like is huge. And I haven't read this one yet, but it has been on my list for a really long time. One of the reasons I actually haven't picked it up is because I know it's going to make me feel all the feelings. Mm-hmm. And because in grad school, I worked with youth in detention, right? Like they weren't in prison. They were just court involved. So they were in basically juvenile detention. And like one of the things that frustrates me the most about the world in general is how dehumanizing that is for folks. Like, and how quickly we fail to see people as people if they are in the prison system in any capacity, especially kids, because like they're kids, man. Like, and again, like society did this to them. They did not do this to themselves. And it's hard. Like it's hard, and it makes me really angry too. So yeah, we did get really heavy. And the last one that I have to talk about is called Blood, Water, Paint by Joy McCullough. And it is, oh man, it's so good. It's hard. It's another book that's going to make you feel all the feelings, but it's so good. I do straight out the gate want to put in a content warning for sexual assault, because that does play a really big part in this book, but it is about a Renaissance painter, one of the most prolific like women Renaissance painters. Her name is Artemisia Gentileschi, which I always have to say slow because I always mess up that name.
I've been mispronouncing it apparently since I have read that book.
I first heard about Artemisia in my undergrad art history classes. I was an art major in undergrad, and that is like why I picked up this book. I mean, I read quite a few novels in verse at the best of times, but as soon as I heard that this one was coming out, I lost it. Like I was so excited, because she is one of my favorite painters. She was one of the first to be able like have a platform to tell women's stories from the perspective of a woman, right? Like historically, women were not included in like the academies and all of the fun. Like they couldn't be artists in the way that men could be artists, right? And that's why she's one of the most prolific, because she had that opportunity.
Well, and at first in the book, she's signing her dad's name on everything she paints.
Yeah, her dad is a painter, and she's basically doing the work for him.
Yep.
Which is already like a whole level of garbage that I hate a bunch. Some of the most famous paintings that Artemisia Gentileschi has done are biblical in nature. I think it's her painting of Judith, who was a woman who she killed a general.
That's my favorite.
It's the best. It's the best. Artemisia's Judith is compared to like Caravaggio's Judith, and like they're different. Like it's really,
like the male gaze kind of.
It is. It honestly is. Yeah. Like any like every person I've talked to who knows this painting and like looks at this painting is like, oh yeah, that's a woman doing what she needs to do in order to like get stuff done. Judith and Susanna are like the two paintings that she's working on, and like telling these stories from the female perspective, where everything she's seen before, all of these paintings done by men have been like, they're not accurate, right? Because it's men telling a woman's story, like, and that like, and they're not doing it effectively in her mind, so and like the connection between the painter Artemisia and then these two characters, these biblical figures that she's trying to tell their story and like connects to their stories in really profound and interesting ways. It is a fictionalized account of Artemisia Gentileschi's life. So like there are things that ring true, like her basically doing a bunch of work for her father. Again, there's sexual assault, which she did like actually go through. But it is still fiction. So like
there's this one quote from that's just, let me show you what a woman can do. And that just always like,
it's so good.
One other author I wanted to talk about, who is a little lighter, yay, right, is Kwame Alexander. And so he writes a lot of books in verse. He's very prolific. He writes a lot. He has a lot of children's books and some other stuff too. But he writes a lot of his books in verse are on two kind of different topics. Like there are at least 3 about sports, and then there are, I can think of 2 off the top of my head that are about music. So they're definitely a little lighter than a lot of the other books we've been talking about today. I mean, there's still serious stuff happening. Like my favorite one is probably Booked, which is about soccer. But it's also about this kid finding out that his parents are getting a divorce, right? So there's always a heavier topic in there, but it's not quite as heavy as like Bloodwater Paint or A Long Way Down. And his books also, Kwame Alexander's books are probably a little, if you're like a little younger, they're probably like more appropriate for a younger reader. Kwame Alexander is a great author. So if you want to try a book in verse, I like very highly recommend his work, especially if you're into sports or music.
People like Jason Reynolds and Jacqueline Woodson too, like reference him a lot. Everybody also references Jacqueline Woodson because she's incredible.
Awesome.
Brown Girl Dreaming is another novel in verse for young adults, and it is Jacqueline Woodson's memoir. So kind of hits at another genre. But it's about her growing up in the rural South and moving to New York. And like having, again, kind of like Clap When You Land, like having homes in 2 different places. That's not really what Clap When You Land is about, but like there's a connection there for me. And yeah, like it really gets at, I think some of the themes in that novel specifically are like growing up when you feel home in 2 very different places. And just kind of, goes into the really important relationship she has with her grandparents. It's also the 60s. She's growing up in the 60s, so the civil rights movement is very much a part of that narrative. But again, another one that like plays into empathy and, understanding people from different backgrounds, and just like anything by Jacqueline Woodson, I also love. And yeah, her body of work is really diverse in genre and scope too, because I'm also thinking about If You Come Softly, which is a prose retelling of like Romeo and Juliet with a Black boy and a Jewish girl. So definitely another author to check out.
Thanks for hanging out with us while we talk about some books in verse. We're going to put some links in the description to the books that we talked about in the catalog. And if you liked this video, check out some of our other Teens Read videos.
Yes. In conclusion, I love novels in verse so much. Sorry.